At 12:42 in the afternoon on July 20th, 1944, a briefcase packed with roughly a kilogram of plastic explosive detonated inside a wooden conference hut at Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters in East Prussia, a complex known as the Wolf's Lair. The blast tore through the room with enough force to kill 4 men outright and injure nearly everyone else present, shredding the heavy wooden table around which Hitler and his senior military staff had gathered to review the day's situation reports. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, who had personally carried the briefcase into the room and positioned it beneath the table before excusing himself on the pretext of an urgent phone call, was already miles away, boarding a plane back to Berlin, convinced that he had just succeeded in killing the man he and a small network of fellow conspirators had spent years plotting to remove. Hitler survived. He would later attribute his survival to what he described as the intervention of Providence, a belief he held with genuine and unshakable conviction for the remainder of his life. The actual explanation was considerably less mystical. Sometime in the minutes before the bomb detonated, an officer named Heinz Brandt, shifting his position at the crowded table to get a better look at the map spread across it, had bumped Stauffenberg's briefcase with his leg and, finding it in his way, moved it to the far side of a heavy oak table support leg, inadvertently placing a substantial obstruction directly between the explosive charge and the spot where Hitler stood. The table leg absorbed and deflected a significant portion of the blast. Hitler emerged from the wreckage with ruptured eardrums, burns, and dozens of wood splinters embedded in his legs, his trousers shredded, but alive, ambulatory, and within hours, well enough to personally greet Benito Mussolini, who arrived at the Wolf's Lair for a scheduled visit that same afternoon, and to walk him through the smoking ruins of the conference room as evidence of his own survival. This is the story of why an assassination plot that came within one accidental leg movement of succeeding was not, in fact, an isolated close call, but rather the most famous entry in a much longer and stranger catalog. Historians who have carefully documented the full record of plots, plans, and individual attempts against Hitler's life between his rise to power in the early 1930s and his death in 1945 have identified at least 42 separate, credible attempts, ranging from lone individuals stalking him with pistols, to sophisticated bombs built by his own general staff officers, to poison plots and aircraft sabotage schemes that never advanced past the planning stage. Some of these attempts came remarkably close to succeeding. Others were amateurish and doomed from the outset. But taken together, they form a pattern that reveals something important not just about the individuals who tried to kill Hitler, but about the peculiar, almost accidental combination of factors that kept him alive through all of them. Genuine paranoid security instincts that hardened over time, a habit of erratic schedule changes that repeatedly and unknowingly sabotaged carefully laid plans, mechanical and technical failures at exactly the wrong moments, and a structural problem embedded deep within the German military conspiracy itself, a culture of institutional loyalty and moral hesitation that meant even officers who had access, opportunity, and genuine intent to kill Hitler often found themselves unable, at the final moment, to pull the trigger. To understand why so many attempts failed, you have to look at how differently each category of attacker approached the problem, starting with the earliest and in some ways most poignant attempts, the ones made not by trained military officers with access to explosives and inside knowledge of Hitler's schedule, but by ordinary individuals acting alone, armed with little more than conviction and a pistol, who came astonishingly close to changing the course of the 20th century through nothing more than personal resolve. In October of 1938, a 22-year-old Swiss theology student named Maurice Bavaud arrived in Germany, carrying a pistol, a considerable sum of money, and a plan that, on paper, sounds almost impossibly naive. He intended to get close enough to Adolf Hitler at a public event to shoot him, motivated by a conviction, shaped by his conservative Catholic upbringing, that Hitler represented an existential threat to Christian civilization in Europe. What makes Bavaud's story remarkable is not that his plan succeeded, since it did not, but how close proximity he actually managed to achieve using nothing more than persistence, forged credentials, and an outsider's willingness to simply keep trying when more cautious plotters would have given up. Bavaud first attempted to reach Hitler at the annual commemoration of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch in Munich, an event Hitler attended every November with almost ritualistic consistency. Bavaud positioned himself along the parade route with his pistol, but found the crowd so dense and the security cordon sufficiently effective that he never obtained a clear line of sight, let alone a clean shot. Rather than abandoning the plan, he spent the following weeks attempting to secure a personal audience with Hitler through increasingly elaborate deception, at one point forging a letter of introduction from a French journalist to gain access to Nazi party officials who might arrange a meeting. He traveled to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's Alpine retreat, hoping to intercept him there, and later to Munich again, hoping for another opportunity at a public appearance. None of these efforts succeeded in placing him within striking distance a second time. Running low on money and increasingly desperate, Bavaud was eventually arrested in December 1938 by a train conductor who caught him attempting to board without a valid ticket. An almost absurdly mundane end to a months-long assassination campaign. Under interrogation, his actual intentions came to light. He was tried, convicted, and executed in 1941. Bavaud's failure illustrates a pattern that would repeat across nearly every lone actor attempt against Hitler throughout the 1930s and into the war years. Individuals motivated by genuine conviction and willing to accept enormous personal risk consistently found that raw determination alone could not overcome the practical, structural advantages that protected Hitler even in his early years in power. Nazi security arrangements around public appearances, while less sophisticated than the elaborate multi-layered protection Hitler would eventually receive once war began, were still substantial enough that an outsider without inside knowledge of exact routes, timing, and security gaps faced enormous odds even before considering the challenge of actually landing a fatal shot or detonating a bomb in a crowded public setting. The crowds themselves worked against would-be assassins as much as any deliberate security measure, since dense masses of supporters made both aiming and escape extraordinarily difficult, and Nazi rallies were specifically choreographed to maximize exactly this kind of tightly packed proximity between Hitler and adoring crowds, which had the incidental effect of making individual attackers easier to spot and physically restrain. There were other lone attempts during this period with similarly unsuccessful outcomes. A Jewish carpenter named Helmut Hirsch was recruited by an anti-Nazi resistance network in 1936 to smuggle a bomb into Nazi party headquarters in Nuremberg, but was arrested before he could carry out the plan, betrayed by an informant embedded within the resistance cell that had recruited him. Joseph Thomas, a German communist, made loose plans to attack Hitler during public appearances in the mid-1930s, but was arrested by the Gestapo before advancing beyond preliminary planning, part of a broader wave of arrests targeting communist and socialist resistance networks that the Nazi security apparatus prioritized as a primary internal threat throughout the regime's early years. What unites nearly all of these early individual attempts is the same fundamental problem. However sincere the motivation, isolated individuals operating without institutional resources, insider access, or technical support faced a security apparatus that, even in its earliest and least refined form, was specifically designed to prevent exactly this category of threat. Since Hitler and his inner circle understood from the party's violent street-fighting origins in the 1920s that political assassination was a genuine and constant risk, requiring active countermeasures. If Bavaud's story demonstrates how far determination alone could carry a lone attacker without technical sophistication, the case of Georg demonstrates the opposite. What happens when a lone individual combines genuine determination with real technical skill, meticulous planning, and months of patient preparation, and still, in the end, falls victim to nothing more than an unpredictable change in the weather? Elser was a skilled carpenter and former factory worker from southern Germany who had grown increasingly convinced, through 1938 and into 1939 that Hitler was leading Germany toward a catastrophic war, and that his death represented the only remaining way to prevent it. Unlike Bavard, Elser did not rely on improvised opportunity or forged credentials. He identified a specific recurring event with a fixed, predictable location. The annual commemoration of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, held every November 8th at Munich's Bürgerbräukeller, where Hitler delivered a lengthy speech to assembled party veterans every single year, without exception. Elser reasoned that if he could plant an explosive device inside the building itself, timed to detonate during the speech, he would not need to rely on crowds, security gaps, or personal proximity at all. Over more than 30 consecutive nights beginning in August 1939, Elser broke into the Bürgerbräukeller after closing hours and painstakingly hollowed out a cavity inside one of the load-bearing pillars directly behind the speaker's podium, working in near-total darkness with hand tools to avoid detection, packing the resulting cavity with explosives he had gradually acquired and modified himself, drawing on skills from his background in precision metalworking to build a reliable timer mechanism capable of running for days without inspection. By early November, his device was in place, hidden inside structural woodwork that no one had any reason to examine, set to detonate at 9:20 in the evening on November 8th, precisely calculated to coincide with the point in Hitler's annual speech when, based on years of consistent precedent, he would be standing at the podium directly in front of the rigged pillar. On the night itself, Hitler did give his speech at the Bürgerbräukeller as expected. But 1939 was not an ordinary year. War with Poland had begun 2 months earlier, and worsening autumn weather across Germany had grounded the aircraft Hitler typically used to fly back to Berlin following the annual commemoration. Rather than risk the flight, Hitler's staff arranged for him to depart earlier than usual and return by train instead, which required him to conclude his remarks well ahead of his customary schedule. Hitler began speaking earlier than planned and delivered a notably shorter address than in previous years, departing the building at approximately 9:07 in the evening, 13 minutes before Elser's carefully calculated detonation. The bomb exploded exactly on schedule, destroying the pillar, collapsing a significant portion of the ceiling onto the area where Hitler had been standing only minutes earlier, and killing 8 people who remained in the building, mostly party members and staff who had lingered after Hitler's early departure. Had Hitler adhered to his ordinary schedule, adjusted for nothing more than an unfavorable weather forecast that had nothing whatsoever to do with security concerns, the explosion would almost certainly have killed him. Elser was captured that same night attempting to cross into Switzerland, arrested by border guards on suspicion of smuggling before any connection to the Munich bombing had even been established, caught by nothing more than routine border enforcement rather than any specific investigative breakthrough. Under interrogation, he eventually confessed to building and planting the device, providing details so specific and technically accurate that Gestapo investigators, initially skeptical that a single individual acting alone could have executed such a sophisticated plot, ultimately became convinced he had acted without any organized conspiracy or foreign intelligence backing, a conclusion that modern historians examining the case have generally supported. Elser was held in concentration camps for the remainder of the war as a special prisoner and was executed at Dachau in April 1945, just weeks before the war's end, on direct orders from Hitler himself. The Elser case would go on to haunt Hitler's security apparatus for the remainder of the war, precisely because it demonstrated so clearly how close a patient, skilled individual could come to success using nothing more sophisticated than careful observation of Hitler's own predictable habits. From this point forward, Hitler's staff began deliberately introducing irregularity and unpredictability into his schedule and movements wherever possible, a security philosophy that would go on to inadvertently sabotage several of the later, more sophisticated plots organized by military conspirators within his own general staff. while Elser and Bavaud represent the category of isolated individuals acting entirely outside any organized network. A parallel and ultimately far more consequential thread of resistance was developing simultaneously within the German military itself. Among the very officers who had sworn a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler and who possessed, by virtue of their positions, something no lone civilian attacker could ever obtain: routine, unquestioned proximity to Hitler himself, along with access to weapons, explosives, and military transport that made assassination technically far more feasible. The roots of this military conspiracy trace back to 1938, well before the war began, centered initially around General Ludwig Beck, then serving as chief of the Army General Staff, and a small circle of like-minded officers who had grown alarmed by what they saw as Hitler's reckless drive toward a European war that Germany's military, still rebuilding from the restrictions imposed after the First World War, was not yet prepared to fight. Beck and his co-conspirators, including intelligence officer Hans Oster within the Abwehr, developed a plan during the Sudetenland crisis of 1938 to arrest Hitler and seize control of the government should he order an invasion of Czechoslovakia over British and French objections, calculating that such an invasion would trigger a wider European war that Germany would lose. The plan depended entirely on Britain and France standing firm in their opposition to German expansion, giving the conspirators political cover to argue that Hitler's recklessness, not any lack of patriotism on their part, justified his removal. The plan collapsed before it could be tested, for a reason entirely outside the conspirators' control. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, seeking to avoid war at nearly any cost, traveled to Munich and negotiated an agreement that handed Hitler the Sudetenland without a fight, an outcome that Beck and his fellow plotters had specifically not anticipated, and that instantly eliminated their pretext for action. Hitler's bloodless diplomatic triumph, achieved through negotiation rather than the invasion the conspirators had expected, made him appear more successful and less reckless than ever in the eyes of the German public, and critically, in the eyes of many officers within the military itself who might otherwise have been sympathetic to the conspiracy. Beck resigned his position in protest, but did not abandon his opposition entirely, becoming instead a central, if largely behind the scenes, figure connecting various resistance-minded officers throughout the years that followed. This early failure illustrates a structural problem that would recur throughout the entire history of the military conspiracy against Hitler, right up to the climactic events of July 1944. The plotters were rarely unified simply around opposition to Hitler in the abstract. They needed a specific, triggering justification, a moment when Hitler's actions could be framed not as a betrayal of personal loyalty or military honor, but as a reckless threat to Germany itself that demanded action in the nation's genuine interest. This need for justification mattered enormously within a German officer corps steeped in a specific cultural mythology about the end of the First World War, in which many officers had come to believe that Germany's defeat in 1918 resulted not from military failure on the battlefield, but from a stab in the back, delivered by civilian politicians and revolutionaries who had undermined the army's will to fight from behind the front lines. Whether or not individual officers within the resistance consciously articulated this fear, the specter of once again being seen as having betrayed Germany's soldiers in the field, this time by removing a wartime head of state through assassination, weighed heavily on a conspiracy whose members were, almost without exception, deeply conservative, intensely patriotic career officers who had built their entire adult lives around concepts of duty, honor, and institutional loyalty. Colonel Henning von Tresckow, who would go on to become perhaps the single most persistent and determined figure within the military resistance throughout the war years, understood this psychological barrier better than almost anyone in the conspiracy, and worked deliberately to overcome it among his fellow officers. Tresckow, serving on the staff of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, had witnessed German atrocities against Soviet civilians and Jewish populations firsthand, and had concluded, well before most of his colleagues, that Hitler represented not merely a strategic liability who might lose the war, but a moral catastrophe whose actions had already placed Germany beyond any conventional standard of honorable conduct. Tresckow spent years recruiting, organizing, and psychologically preparing a small network of like-minded officers throughout the military and intelligence services, understanding that any successful action against Hitler would require not just a single successful assassination attempt, but a coordinated political and military plan to seize control of the government in the immediate aftermath. Since killing Hitler without a functioning plan to establish an alternative government risked simply creating chaos that hardline Nazi loyalists elsewhere in the regime could exploit to seize power themselves. By 1943, with Germany's military fortunes turning decisively after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, Tresckow's network had grown sophisticated enough to attempt direct action. On March 13, 1943, Hitler visited the headquarters of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, providing Tresckow and his close collaborator, a young officer named Fabian von Schlabrendorf, with an opportunity they had spent months preparing to exploit. Tresckow approached one of Hitler's aides, Colonel Heinz Brandt, the same officer who would later, entirely by coincidence, shift Stauffenberg's briefcase and inadvertently save Hitler's life the following year, and asked him to personally carry a package back to Berlin aboard Hitler's own aircraft, framing the request as a favor involving 2 bottles of Cointreau owed to a mutual acquaintance in the capital. Brandt agreed, without suspicion. The package was not brandy. It was a bomb, built using British-supplied plastic explosive and a specially modified silent fuse mechanism, disguised inside what genuinely appeared to be 2 ordinary liquor bottles. Schlabrendorf activated the fuse by crushing a small acid capsule inside the device shortly before Brandt boarded the plane, a mechanism designed to corrode through a wire restraint over a period of roughly 30 minutes, at which point the bomb would detonate. Time to destroy the aircraft in mid-flight over Soviet territory, an outcome that would likely have been attributed to enemy anti-aircraft fire or mechanical failure rather than sabotage, since no wreckage would survive intact enough to reveal the true cause. The aircraft landed safely in East Prussia roughly 2 hours later. The bomb never detonated. Schlabrendorf, monitoring the situation with mounting alarm as reports confirmed Hitler's safe arrival, was forced to improvise an explanation for retrieving the still-live explosive device from Brandt before its presence could be discovered, telling Brandt that he had accidentally sent the wrong package and needed to make an exchange. He then spent an anxious overnight train journey to personally retrieve the bomb, dismantle it in secret, and confirm what had gone wrong. The extreme cold in the aircraft's unheated cargo hold, at the high altitude the plane had traveled, had likely caused the chemical fuse mechanism to freeze and fail to corrode through its restraining wire at the expected rate, a mechanical vulnerability that British intelligence, who had originally supplied similar devices, had not adequately accounted for. In cold weather operational conditions, the conspiracy had come remarkably close to success, undone not by any security failure or lack of planning, but by a basic problem of chemistry interacting badly with high-altitude cold. Undeterred, and in some ways emboldened by how close this attempt had come, the resistance network attempted a second approach less than 2 weeks later, on March 21, 1943, during a public event in Berlin where Hitler was scheduled to tour an exhibition of captured Soviet military equipment. This time, the plan called for a direct suicide bombing rather than a delayed timer device. Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, an intelligence officer who had volunteered to serve as Hitler's personal guide through the exhibition specifically to gain the close, sustained proximity the plan required, carried 2 British-made explosive charges concealed in his coat pockets, each fitted with a 10-minute fuse. Gersdorf's plan was to activate the fuses discreetly once he was standing beside Hitler during the tour, then remain close enough to guarantee that when the charges detonated, both men would be killed together. A genuine suicide mission, undertaken by an officer who had concluded that his own survival was an acceptable price for finally succeeding where previous plots had failed. Gersdorf activated the fuses as Hitler began the tour, expecting a walkthrough lasting the customary 30 minutes or more, which would have given the 10-minute charges ample opportunity to detonate while Hitler remained in the building. Hitler, however, moved through the exhibition with unusual speed that day, spending barely 8 to 10 minutes examining the captured equipment before abruptly departing the building entirely, a deviation from his typical pace that, as with the Elser bombing years earlier, had nothing whatsoever to do with any security concern or suspicion, and everything to do with simple, unpredictable personal impatience on that particular afternoon. Gersdorf, carrying 2 live explosive devices with fuses already burning and no further opportunity to complete his mission, was forced to excuse himself immediately, locate a restroom within the building, and manually defuse both charges with only minutes to spare before they would have detonated regardless of Hitler's presence, killing Gersdorf alone rather than achieving anything resembling the mission's actual objective. The pattern of meticulously planned suicide missions, undone by Hitler's unpredictable habits and shifting schedule, repeated itself twice more in the months leading up to the July 1944 attempt, each time involving young officers willing to sacrifice their own lives, and each time thwarted not by any failure of nerve or planning, but by circumstances entirely outside the conspirators' control. In late 1943, a young cavalry officer named Axel von dem Busche volunteered for what may have been the most audacious suicide plan of the entire resistance effort. Busche arranged to model a newly designed winter military greatcoat and equipment set during a demonstration for Hitler, a routine event where army officers showcased new uniform and gear designs for approval. Busch's actual plan involved concealing a bomb within the equipment he would be wearing, then grabbing Hitler and holding him at close range as the device detonated, guaranteeing both their deaths through simple physical proximity that no last-minute schedule change could easily disrupt, since the entire premise of the demonstration required Hitler to personally inspect the equipment Busche was wearing. The demonstration was scheduled, postponed, and rescheduled multiple times through the final weeks of 1943, and before it could finally take place, an Allied bombing raid on the depot storing the sample equipment destroyed the specific greatcoats and gear that had been prepared for the presentation, forcing an indefinite postponement. Busche was subsequently reassigned to frontline duty, where he was severely wounded in combat before any rescheduled demonstration could occur, ending his direct participation in the plot through circumstances that had nothing to do with the conspiracy itself. A second officer, Ewald Heinrich von Kleist, volunteered for what was essentially the same plan in early 1944, once again involving a uniform demonstration that would place him in close physical proximity to Hitler while wearing a concealed explosive device. Kleist's father, aware of his son's intentions and the near certainty that the mission would cost him his life, reportedly told him that a man who did not seize this kind of opportunity to act against Hitler would never again be able to feel at ease in his own life, a stark measure of how deeply conviction ran within at least some families connected to the resistance network. This demonstration, too, was ultimately cancelled, this time because Hitler's own staff rescheduled and then scrapped the specific event Kleist had been preparing for, part of the broader pattern of erratic schedule changes that had become increasingly characteristic of Hitler's movements as the war situation deteriorated and his own security instincts, hardened by years of surviving previous close calls he was often entirely unaware of, made his routine progressively less predictable. A third attempt in July 1944 involved a much more direct method than any bomb, a straightforward assassination by pistol, carried out by an officer with legitimate, repeated access to Hitler's military briefings. Captain Eberhard von Breitenbuch, serving as an aide to a field marshal who regularly attended Hitler's situation briefings, volunteered to shoot Hitler directly with a concealed pistol during a routine visit to the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine residence, on July 11, 1944, just 9 days before Stauffenberg's bombing attempt at the Wolf's Lair. Breitenbuch had the weapon, had the access, and had made the personal decision to act. What he did not anticipate was a last-minute change in security protocol. Guards, tightening procedures around Hitler's briefings during this specific period, informed Breitenbuch upon his arrival that adjutants would no longer be permitted to enter the briefing room alongside the officers they were escorting, a new restriction with no specific connection to any suspicion about Breitenbuch personally, but one that nonetheless eliminated his access at the exact moment he had prepared to act. He returned home without ever entering the room where Hitler stood, his weapon still loaded and unused, the mission abandoned not through any failure of nerve, but through an administrative security adjustment that happened, by pure coincidence, to fall on precisely the day he had chosen to act. These repeated near misses, spanning roughly a year and a half of increasingly sophisticated planning, reveal something important about the actual mechanics of Hitler's survival that goes well beyond simple luck in the abstract. Each of these plots was technically sound, involved genuine access and genuine willingness to sacrifice, and failed specifically because Hitler's own patterns of behavior, his impatience during the exhibition tour, his tendency to reschedule and cancel appointments, the general unpredictability that had become a deliberate security habit since the Elster bombing years earlier, happened to intersect, entirely without any specific knowledge of the plots themselves, with the exact narrow windows the conspirators needed to succeed. By July 1944, Claus von Stauffenberg had emerged as the conspiracy's central figure, occupying a position that finally offered the combination of access and authority the resistance had lacked throughout years of near-miss attempts by junior officers without the standing to trigger a full military takeover in the aftermath of a successful assassination. Stauffenberg, severely wounded in North Africa the previous year, he had lost his right hand, 2 fingers on his left hand, and an eye in an Allied air attack, had been appointed Chief of Staff to the commander of the replacement army, a position that gave him regular, legitimate access to Hitler's military briefings and, critically, the administrative authority needed to help coordinate the broader coup plan, codenamed Operation Valkyrie, that Treschow and other conspirators had spent years developing as the necessary follow-through to any successful assassination. The plan for July 20th called for Stauffenberg to plant a bomb during a scheduled briefing at the Wolf's Lair, then immediately fly back to Berlin to help direct Operation Valkyrie, a plan originally designed as a legitimate military contingency for suppressing potential uprisings by foreign forced laborers within Germany, which the conspirators had quietly modified to instead mobilize reserve army units to seize key government buildings, communication centers, and Nazi party facilities across Berlin and other major cities the moment Hitler's death was confirmed, moving quickly enough to establish an alternative government before hardline Nazi loyalists could organize an effective response. Given his physical injuries, which left him with only 3 fingers total across both hands, Stauffenberg required assistance simply to arm the bomb's fuse mechanism in the minutes before the briefing, a logistical complication that meant he was only able to prepare and activate one of the 2 explosive charges he had originally intended to use, working with reduced dexterity in a cramped bathroom adjacent to the briefing room while an aide stood watch, ultimately deciding to proceed with a single charge rather than risk further delay that might have prevented him from planting any device at all. The rest of the day's events are, in their broad outline, well known. The briefcase placed beneath the table, Brandt's incidental repositioning of it behind the oak support leg, Stauffenberg's departure on the pretext of a phone call, the explosion, and Hitler's survival against odds that should have been overwhelmingly against him. What receives less attention, but matters enormously to understanding why this closest of all attempts still ultimately failed to remove Hitler from power, is what happened in Berlin over the following hours after Stauffenberg landed and proceeded, based on early and inaccurate reports reaching the capital, on the assumption that Hitler was dead. The coup's failure in Berlin stemmed from a combination of communication delays, institutional hesitation, and the fatal moral uncertainty that had haunted the conspiracy from its very earliest days back in 1938. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army, and the officer whose authority was theoretically required to formally activate Operation Valkyrie's mobilization orders, hesitated for critical hours rather than committing decisively to the coup, uncertain whether Hitler was actually dead and unwilling to stake his own life and career on reports that remained, for much of the afternoon, genuinely unconfirmed. This hesitation proved catastrophic. By early evening, confirmation arrived from the Wolf's Lair that Hitler had survived and was, in fact, well enough to speak by telephone directly with officers in Berlin, undermining the entire premise the conspirators needed to justify their actions to the wider military establishment, whose cooperation the coup absolutely required to succeed against the still loyal SS and Nazi Party security apparatus. Joseph Goebbels, based in Berlin, and one of the few senior Nazi officials who acted swiftly and decisively once he understood a coup attempt was underway, personally arranged for Hitler to speak by telephone to a wavering army officer, Major Otto Ernst Riemer, who had been ordered by the conspirators to arrest Goebbels as part of the Berlin takeover, but had instead grown suspicious of the orders he had received. Hearing Hitler's voice directly, confirming beyond any doubt that the assassination had failed, Riemer immediately reversed course, placing his forces instead at Goebbels' disposal to suppress the coup rather than support it. Within hours, the conspiracy collapsed entirely. Stauffenberg, who, in a desperate and transparent attempt to protect himself by appearing loyal, personally ordered the immediate execution of Stauffenberg and several co-conspirators that same night, before they could be interrogated and potentially implicate him in the plot he had hesitated to support, and thousands of others connected, sometimes only tangentially, to the broader resistance network were arrested, tortured, and executed in the weeks that followed, in a purge that ultimately claimed the lives of an estimated 5,000 people and eliminated most of the remaining capacity within the German military for any further organized resistance against Hitler for the remainder of the war. It is worth noting that not every entry in the documented catalog of 42 attempts originated from within Germany itself. British intelligence developed its own detailed assassination plan, codenamed Operation Foxley, studying Hitler's daily walking routine at the Berghof with an eye toward a long-range sniper attack, complete with detailed reconnaissance of his movement patterns and potential firing positions along a path he walked with notable regularity each morning. The plan was fully developed on paper, down to specific rifle recommendations and sniper positioning, but was ultimately never authorized for execution, based on a strategic calculation within British intelligence circles that a surviving, increasingly erratic Hitler making worsening military decisions was, from a purely pragmatic wartime perspective, of greater value to the Allied war effort than a martyred Hitler, whose removal might allow a more competent military leadership to emerge and potentially prolong German resistance through more effective strategic decision-making. Looking back across the full documented record of attempts against Hitler's life, from Bavaud's amateurish stalking in 1938, through Elser's meticulous solo bombing, through years of increasingly sophisticated military conspiracies involving frozen fuses, canceled uniform demonstrations, and a security guard's last-minute policy change, all the way to Stauffenberg's briefcase bomb deflected by an accidentally repositioned table leg. A clear pattern emerges that has less to do with any singular explanation and more to do with several overlapping factors compounding against every single plot in turn. The first factor is Hitler's own genuinely unpredictable behavior, which functioned as an inadvertent security measure more effective than almost anything his formal protective apparatus deliberately designed. Time and again, plots meticulously calibrated around his known habits and typical schedules were undone by exactly the kind of last-minute deviation. An early departure due to weather, an impatiently rushed exhibition tour, a rescheduled uniform demonstration that no conspirator could have reasonably anticipated or planned around. because Hitler himself often did not decide to deviate from his routine until the moment he actually did so. The second factor is the genuine bad luck of mechanical and technical failure at precisely the wrong moments, most starkly illustrated by the frozen fuse aboard Hitler's aircraft in March 1943, a failure rooted in nothing more dramatic than the physical chemistry of an explosive device exposed to extreme cold, but one that came within minutes of changing the entire trajectory of the war had it functioned as designed. The third and perhaps most consequential factor is the structural weakness embedded within the military conspiracy itself. Not a lack of courage among the individual officers willing to carry bombs into rooms they knew they might not walk out of, but the broader institutional hesitation that repeatedly slowed the conspiracy's political and military follow-through, even when individual assassination attempts came close to succeeding. Beck's aborted 1938 plan collapsed when its political justification evaporated at Munich. From's hesitation on the afternoon of July 20th, 1944, gave Loyalist forces exactly the window of confusion they needed to reassert control before the coup could consolidate its gains. Across the entire 6-year span of documented plots, the officers most willing to personally sacrifice their lives were rarely the same officers holding the institutional authority needed to translate a successful assassination into an actual transfer of power, and the gap between individual willingness to die and collective willingness to act decisively in the chaotic hours immediately following an assassination proved, again and again, to be the resistance's most persistent and ultimately fatal weakness. There is a final, darker irony sitting at the center of this entire story. Each time Hitler survived one of these 42 documented attempts, whether through a table leg, a frozen fuse, an early train departure, or a canceled uniform fitting, his own conviction that he was personally protected by Providence and destined to complete his historical mission grew measurably stronger, a belief he referenced explicitly and repeatedly in private conversations with his inner circle throughout the war's final years. The same near misses that should have served as urgent warnings about the depth of opposition within his own military establishment instead reinforced, in Hitler's own mind, a sense of messianic invulnerability that made him progressively less receptive to counsel. Less willing to accept battlefield realities his generals increasingly understood to be catastrophic, and more inclined to attribute Germany's mounting military failures to insufficient willpower and hidden betrayal rather than his own strategic misjudgments. The conspirators who came so close to killing him across so many separate attempts, spanning nearly the entire duration of the Nazi regime, did not merely fail to save Germany from the war's final, most destructive years. In a bitter and unintended sense, their repeated failures may have actively contributed to prolonging exactly the catastrophe they had each, in their own way, given everything to prevent.